Hello, this is the review video for the first week in paper reading. So I've left the comments that I have in class on the slide so that way we could all see them. And we'll just talk generally about some issues with a couple papers. Well, really an issue with the last paper, and I'll try to be nice about it. So the first paper was by Safran et al. It was 2 pages, and it was a pretty quick read. It was a dense read for sure. There's a lot of information in there. So, just as a sort of preface to understand the context of the article, it was written for a science journal, not necessarily just social sciences, and it's meant to be like an introduction and overview to child language acquisition. So, there's obviously a lot of information there. A lot of it wasn't in too much detail. It seemed to jump around from topic to topic to topic to topic, but that's the purpose of that writing. So, although we may have criticisms of that, and we certainly talked about that in class, how some details were just not put in, there's a reason for why that happened. And we can still criticize those things, and we can say if this paper was somewhere else, how could it be improved? But for the journal it was in, I thought it was a pretty decent paper. So I won't talk about any of these problems, but I will tell you about some of the questions I have while going through an article. So while you read, you probably have questions, and no matter how stupid you think a question is, or even if you know the answer, sometimes it's good to put your thoughts out there because those thoughts can eventually lead into papers or research questions or other things you could explore. So even if it's unrelated, even if it's a stupid question that, well, if you think it's stupid, even if you think the question is too basic or way too big, it's just about putting your thoughts out there. So, for example, it says once an infant has been familiarized with the sample of this language, a new sample or a sample from a different language is presented to the infant. So, this is talking about experiments to test perceptual differences. So, one question I had here was with these fake languages, how can we possibly tell what is happening actually inside the mind of a child? Because we're just listening to, well, we're not listening, we're watching behavioral changes in the baby, but we're not really doing anything with the brain. And I have another question here, like, what are the boundaries? So, how different does something have to be before a baby notices that it's different? And that's not necessarily shown here, but it's something that, is a valid question. Here is another excerpt. I'll try not to read all of it. So, more specifically, infants do not detect merely how frequently syllable pairs occur, but rather the probabilities with which one syllable predicts another. What makes this finding astonishing is that infants as young as 8 months begin to perform these computations with as little as 2 minutes of exposure. So it's just saying that at around 8 months, babies can detect syllables and can use their understanding of language to detect word boundaries. So my question here, they say as little as 8 months. Is this something that happens like they've just suddenly got it? Is this sort of a gradient? So maybe, I don't know, at 6 months, let's say, how do I want to do this? Let's say we have 5 minutes and we have 1 minute and we have 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months. Is it something that sort of goes like this? Or is it more of a graph where it's just they can't do it? And then here we have 2 minutes being the norm. So, how does it change over time? That's a question I had. And why doesn't this happen before 8 months? What's happening in the baby's brain that prevents them from doing this before being as young as 8 months years old? Is it that they can't do it, or is it just that it takes a really long time for them to do it? There was a paragraph about musical tones, and in this paragraph, I found it a little difficult to understand what the point of musical tones was. Was it to say it's just statistical learning, or is there some other connection to tones and languages that was maybe wanted to be explored here but didn't? So the question I have is there a connection between language and music that has yet to be explored? And actually, there's some of that in the LING Dev lab at SFU. They do some work on that. And if children can predict tones in music and they can predict, what's going to happen in terms of language, which ability happen first? Does music come before language? Does language come before music? Or are they something that develop simultaneously? So these are some questions I had from that. And that's sort of an interesting departure from linguistics to think about language and music. And there is research in that area. Finally, well, not finally, I think this is the second to last one I have here. Adults are quite adept at parsing sentences to determine relational meanings. In fact, studies of adult language comprehension indicate that readers and listeners are so skilled that they can do it in real time. So this talks about adults, but I'd like to see this happen with babies. But how can we figure that out? Well, we know that babies look at things as they hear them, so it would be interesting to compare adults and children in terms of processing sentences in real time to see when that happens, when children acquire adult-like comprehension for simple sentences, and when sentences get more complex. Like the man who I knew believed was one of the best people around went to the store. That's a complex sentence. And the question is, how do children process that? When do they get that ability? So these are just some more questions I had. And this is particularly because I like experimental syntax. It's what I'm familiar with, it's what I've been doing. So I have a few more specific questions about experimental syntax and reading comprehension than I do other areas. What I found really interesting at the end of this paper is that they say this. It is therefore difficult to determine whether any particular linguistic element observed in a child's language is inborn or derived. And this is interesting because it's just so major of a question in linguistics. This, like, is it nature? Is it nurture? This is one of the most fundamental questions in linguistics. And it's almost hidden in a way in this paper. It's a conclusive sentence, but I feel like the value of answering this question is just understated here. So it seems so simple when it's something so big. It almost reads as if this could be figured out by a scientist if they were to conduct the right experiments. But the reality is, it's probably going to take a whole field to figure this out. So this is more of a comment than a question. And finally, here's one where I'll play devil's advocate. So it says this is about sign language. So it says the first group of children invented signs for things they needed to talk about and immediately began developing ways to string them together into sentences. So sign languages are real languages. Let's get this out of the way. But when you have something like nouns and verbs back to back, and you're just stringing those together at a young age, is that demonstrating language, or is that just pattern matching? Like thing, action. So it's probably not pattern matching, it's probably language, but there's some skepticism there that I think at a healthy dose is probably good for the field. And because we're talking about signs, we're talking about children who cannot hear. So the previous part of this was all about acquisition of sounds and syllables. So if children can't hear, my question is then what are the early units of acquisition? What are the ages where that happens? Like, how does that follow the acquisition of hearing children? Does it deviate a lot or is it streamlined? So all of these are questions that could be explored and probably answered by reading some other articles. Now, let's say you read a paper like that and you want to summarize it. Summaries are good because they allow you to remember details about a paper without having to reread the entire paper later in life. So by the time, if you choose to go to graduate school in linguistics, you'll probably have read 40 to 50 papers by then. Instead of having to reread those 40 to 50 papers later, if you want to reference something, you could just take a look at a long list of summaries or annotated bibliographies that you wrote, and you could get that information back. So summaries have really three main parts, and they should be relatively short. So the first main point is what are the main points the authors are making? So what's the purpose of the paper? What's the conclusion? What is like the core detail? So you usually find this information in the abstract. in the introduction or in the conclusion. That's where the main points usually are. Another critical detail of a summary is what details would be relevant for backing up those key points, backing up those main points. So what examples are the most important ones to show one of the findings or one of the main points the author is trying to make? Uh, are all examples relevant? Most of them can be used or tied to the main points, but sometimes they're really specific details that are side points or questions or further investigations that don't really contribute to the core aspect of the article. And finally, what you have in a summary is usually some critiques or future implications. So, whenever you read a paper, you're going to find things that you don't agree with or you have questions about. Maybe it's a methodology, maybe it's a conclusion, maybe it's how they interpret data. And you'll forget that years later. So, including some critiques and problems reminds yourself of the issues in the paper and what could be explored. So we'll practice a little bit with critiques in the next short writing assignment, and we'll continue with that for the major one as well. So looking at the Safran et al. Article, there's really three different sections and three main points they're trying to make here. And instead of writing these as facts, I write them as questions because when I'm writing a summary, if I have questions, I'm just looking to answer those questions. I'm not looking to write too much. So each section I've turned into a question or a series of questions. So the first one, how do infants acquire units of a language? What are those units? Those are the main points they're trying to get across. So by answering those questions, I can hopefully summarize that section in 2 to 5 sentences just by answering those questions and providing some details or examples. Section 2, once words are acquired, how do they build them into complex words and sentences? That's really what they talked about in the second section. So hopefully if I answer that question, I can summarize that in a few sentences. And finally, how do children acquire creativity? That was section 3. It wasn't completely clear compared to other articles that talk about creativity and especially textbooks, but this is basically the ability to create novel utterances using units that they already have acquired. So if we can answer all of these questions in 2 to 5 sentences each, we get a one-page summary that covers the entire paper. Now, of course, this was already a bit of a summary paper, so it's a little bit harder to simplify some things and compact them down. But in a longer paper, we can do the same process and condense a 15-page paper into a 1 or 2-page summary with some critiques. So you can think about any of the critiques that you had for that paper, but we're going to move on to Hutauruk 2015. And we had some questions about this. This was not a dense paper, but it was a paper that everyone in class, well, most people in class agreed, had a lot of words, but didn't really say much. And I'm going to go over those critiques right now, and I'll try to remember to include ones that students came up with as I go through. So usually the most important part is the abstract, and it is misspelled here as abstract. So I'll erase my little joke at the top. I've crossed some things out in this abstract. And the reason I've crossed these things out is because they're redundant. They've already said those things before. So the third sentence is almost an identical copy of the first sentence. So there's no reason to include it in the abstract. Abstracts are supposed to be concise, and we'll talk about them in more detail in week 8 for the Pokemonastics lecture. The same sentence is repeated after all the citations, exactly the same thing that was said before. And later we see, and the approaches in first language acquisition, which have been crossed out, are also things that have been repeated in the very second sentence. So this abstract is not very great. There's a lot of redundancy here. Abstract should be concise, 4 to 7 sentence summaries of the entire paper. So talking about what the goal is, what the method is, what the results are, what the conclusion is. It should be pretty short. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail in a couple weeks. So the first section in a paper is usually the introduction. So introductions typically don't pose any new ideas. Instead, what they do is they look at older material, so things that have already been published, and they use them as groundwork. So they use them as a base for everything that you're about to do. So you introduce the core concepts you're going to talk about or investigate. You're going to introduce any opposing viewpoints. So if you're trying to argue for one model or another, one theory or another, one viewpoint or another, you introduce both. And you're introducing the core arguments that the paper is based off of. So there's some stuff here about cognitive theory. So maybe if you're going to talk or argue for or against cognitive theory, then that's where you'd put that information in the introduction. The most important thing, of course, is the research question. What are you going to study? That is by far the most important thing to put in the introduction so people know what the purpose of the paper is. Sometimes it's not just one section, sometimes it's two, as we see here. There's an introduction and a review of literature section. Sometimes they're the same one, sometimes they're different. It really depends on the length and how relevant it all is to the main paper. So here's the introduction that they gave in the paper. I've taken some of it out. So this is a larger paper. So when you hear a sentence like parents do not teach the native language to their children formally, it does read kind of general, but it does touch on what they're trying to talk about in the paper. So it's not the absolute best intro they probably could have written here, but it's decent. It's still relevant to the task. It's what the experiment touches on. It tries to touch on the role of parents and their children with interactions and types of controlling behavior and things like that. We'll find that the experiment actually does not test any of this, but their goal was to do that. So regardless of how crazy their experiment was with what they're trying to say, it's still a decent intro. The next section is usually a methodology in an experimental paper. So this is an experimental paper. So the methodology shows exactly what they've done. The methodology should talk about the participants, should talk about what type of experiment it is, potentially how it was built if you used a program. It should talk about all of the steps necessary to replicate the experiment. So that way, other researchers can take that and get the same results, or they can take it and modify it and fix it to be better. So sometimes people provide more detail or less detail. It's always better to provide more detail than less detail because that way people can replicate it exactly. You may get complaints or criticisms about the techniques you used. However, it's better to get specific critiques than general critiques because if you give less detail, you may get a lot of questions like, what did you even do? That's one of the questions that I have for this paper. It's not really explained precisely what they've done. It feels like they've left out details either on purpose or by accident. You do get a chance to defend yourself if you have less detail because you can clear things up, but in the end, you're going to be critiqued anyway. And if you don't have enough detail, people might just completely ignore your paper and say, it's not a valid paper, let's not think about it. And that's going to be way worse for you than if there's specific criticisms about small techniques. Because if there's specific criticisms, hey, there's a new paper for you. So here is the methodology in their paper. I've only excluded a couple lines. It is incredibly short. There is not really any detail at all. A couple of things to point out here. They say that this attempts to find out the children problems in first language acquisition by Micaiah Estella at ages 1 to 3 years old. I don't know what that means. Does it mean that the child was examined between ages 1 and 3, or is the child somewhere between age 1 and 3? It's not very clear. They actually give the name of the child and exactly where they live, which is bad. That's unethical. Do not do that. You can give code names to children. You can give them first names that aren't real, but do not give their full name and their place of like where they live. Do not give their residence. People can find that. It says for this research that the writer uses the video recorder to record the conversation of child and parents. So I don't know if this is one conversation or multiple conversations. I would believe it's multiple because it says 1 to 3 years old, but I don't know. It's not very clear here. And it says recording of conversation. Again, I don't know if that should be plural or not. So to critique the methodology is hard because I don't know what's been done. Is it one conversation? Is it multiple? Is it at one age in their life? Is it through multiple ages? It's just really unclear. Now, after a methodology section comes the results section. And the results are where your findings are reported, either with tables, either with some data and evidence, or maybe there's some statistics if you're doing quantitative analysis. This is the results section here. This is very inadequate. There are no examples of anything that they found here. It's just research findings with some headers and some descriptions of those headers. It's not even clear in each case if you're talking about the child or the parents. So if we compare 1 and 2, 1 clearly talks about the child, removing 1 or 2 letters of the word, changing the letters of the word into other letters. That's a thing that children do. That's a phonological error. But 2, for incorrect utterances, it says parents always think that the child will more understand if they say the word such the way the child pronounces it. They do not pronounce something genuinely. This is about the parents, but I thought the analysis was about Micaiah, the kid. So it's unclear why this is even in there. There's some other things here indicating the question, number 6. The child always uses the word ha to indicate the question, which is still unclear and wants to repeat it again. I don't know what the point of this is at this point. Okay, a child does that. What's the problem? Why is it included? And then number 8. This is incredible. And this was pointed out by students before I even got to it. Number 8. The child gives response or information by single words to simplify her or his answer. First of all, if the kid is between ages 1 and 3, this is pretty expected because the kid is young. They're still in the 1 word or 2 word stage, most likely. Second, calling this lazy. Adults do this. It's not laziness, it's efficiency. Why say more word when few word do trick? Like, you just have to you just have to answer the question. This isn't formal writing. This is talking, and this is about a child between the ages of 1 to 3. More importantly, this was supposed to be the results about Micaiah, a kid. Why are they using words like her/his if they're talking about one specific child? They know the gender of the child. They don't have to use this gender neutral expression because they're talking about a particular kid. So the results here don't seem to actually rely that much on the methodology. It seems like the author is just writing stuff in here about general children. But that's not what the experiment was supposed to be about, according to them. Here's another section, and it specifically references Micaiah here according to 4 different stages: the cooing stage, holophrastic stage, telegraphic stage, and later multi-word stage. However, all of these are written generally. A child, a child, a child, a child is able to produce the clear pronunciation. But this is about Micaiah as written here. So it seems as if the results are disconnected from the actual experiment. They didn't find things, perhaps. They didn't provide evidence of finding things. So instead, they wrote generally about children. At least that's my interpretation of this based on the writing. So this is not a good results section at all. There's no evidence to back any of this up. If they transcribed video recordings of conversations, they should have examples of those transcripts to support their conclusions. specifically from Micaiah. If your whole point of the experiment is to analyze a particular child, you cannot make general claims. You have to keep the claims related to that child, related to those conversations. But in this results section, it reads as if they're generalizing to all children or multiple children. But that is simply not what they've done. They cannot make those conclusions because they did not do those things. This is a case study. This is one person. Case studies happen when something is very rare, like there's a medical disease that doctors find are like incredibly rare, like 1 in 1 million people. Maybe it's the first time they've ever seen anything. Maybe participants are very hard to get and analyze because of whatever issue it is. So when you have a case study, you're doing the only thing that you can do. With this study, there is no reason why they couldn't have found more children to analyze. So there's no reason for this to be a case study. They could have found more children, made a more robust experiment, and then reported results. So this whole experiment and results section is just, it's not consistent, it's not well connected, and even compared to the intro and conclusion, it doesn't really talk about any of those things. Yeah, you have some introduction here, but you said you said in the intro that you're looking at Micaiah's language acquisition problems through these 6 stages, which here have been reduced to 4. So it's more interesting is that there's actually some gaps in the stages here. So I don't know. A lot of problems with that experiment and results. And it's probably not necessarily her fault. I think she's just the author has just misunderstood experimental procedure and design. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt there. And I see that in future papers that they wrote, there have been some improvements. So when you get to a conclusion section, which is the final section after results, after discussion, which this paper barely had a discussion section. It was included in the results, but they should be separate. With the conclusion, you're not just restating the information in the introduction. The introduction tells you stuff without any evidence yet. The whole point of the rest of the paper is to provide evidence, to provide new results, to provide a methodology, and so on. So in the conclusion, you should be talking about how you answered your research question in the intro with all this new information in mind. So it's almost like an introduction that's been beefed up. It's answered the questions that the introduction proposes and is you've provided your own evidence to support those conclusions. Sometimes they even put limitations in there. So if something in an experiment happened or there's some design choice that you think might not have worked, you can put those limitations in your writing so other authors and other readers are aware of those limitations and they may be able to improve on them in the future. It's also a place where you can sell your research and say, this is important because, or this contributes to the field in this way, or by looking at this, we can further explore blah, blah, blah. You're trying to make your paper sound like it's important, and everybody embellishes. Everybody. Because in reality, a lot of the papers are not that important in the grand scheme of things. But you're writing for a specific audience. You're writing to make it seem more important than it actually is. I know some people take offense to that, but it's the truth. Unless you're working in a medical field or you're trying to make some things that make humans' lives more easy, it's probably not that important. So sell your work the best you can, embellish a bit, and make it seem like what you're looking at is worth pursuing further. No, I say it's not that important. What I mean is that it's not applicable in importance. Of course, we all want to extend our knowledge of the field, research things, understand how they work, but it's not quite as important as, say, curing cancer or various types of cancers. To put that in perspective. So here's the conclusion that they gave. Now, They mention in the first set of blue highlights, babbling and the two-word stage, which was not included in the results section. So I don't know why they're including it here. They cannot make a conclusion because they have not studied it in the experiment. They also finally tell you how much data they've analyzed. It says the writer analyzes 10 data and divides them into 4 stages. That's fantastic. Why are we waiting to the conclusion to tell us how much data you analyzed? Now, the rest of this is problematic because what they're about to say here, they have not provided any evidence for. In fact, this is very prescriptive. The research was supposed to be a descriptive analysis of the problems with language acquisition, but now they're making recommendations. But that's not what the experiment was about. So here's a few things they say that should just not be said. It is better for the parents to pronounce the word genuinely. I would agree with this in part. However, children will pick up the correct pronunciation, or sorry, the standard pronunciation from their environment anyway. If the parents say things incorrectly or non standardly, they'll still hear other people pronounce it and they'll fix it themselves. Genuinely is also a weird word to say because you can say something genuinely, but it also be wrong. Like, I can genuinely say either for the word either, either. That could be genuine pronunciation, but it's not accurate. Finally, or not finally, next, it will make the child become confused how to differentiate the right or wrong words. No, children don't have this issue. They will figure it out. So that is not scientifically backed. It is better for the parents to avoid responding child's question by using the word ha because it is impolite to respond to the question by using this word. This should not be in a paper at all. This is heavily prescriptive. Not every family thinks that this is rude. This is a familial ideology that should stay within the family. Some children at age 3 or 4 curse, and some parents don't care. Other parents care a lot and they don't let the kid curse at all, ever. So this is this doesn't add anything to the field. It doesn't make the research better. It doesn't make the conclusion better. It doesn't contribute to the field in any way. This is just a personal recommendation. They get even more prescriptive here. Parents should control the child from various media which is suitable to the child needs, such as watching TV. Again, you cannot say this. This is a personal preference. This is not backed by research. Nothing they've said in this paper suggests that TV is harmful to child's language acquisition. Now, the final thing they say that I've highlighted here is incorrect. It's factually incorrect. It is better for the parents to correct the child's pronunciation and grammar directly. No, this does not work. Children will figure it out. Children have different stages of acquisition. They acquire morphemes in different orders. They acquire sounds in different orders. In the two-word stage, in their heads, they form sentences. But what comes out are 2 words at a time, and those 2 words can mean different sentences. You cannot correct the child's pronunciation and grammar because they physically and cognitively cannot produce what should be standard at that point in their life. But they will get there. If something is serious, you go to a speech therapist because they might have issues with certain sounds, and that will appear later in the child's life. Finally, finally, the very last sentence. Let's remind ourselves, this study was about a child between the ages of 1 and 3. And what is said here is parents should listen to the child when he or she expresses ideas such as telling experiences at school. A 1 to 3-year-old child is not yet going to school, most likely. So this last line is completely irrelevant to the experiment, to the methods, to the results. This is just personal opinion. So there's a lot wrong with this conclusion. It doesn't follow from the experiment. It makes personal recommendations about how to talk to your children without having research backing it up. So, lots of problems here. Here's a little summary of my nice critiques of this paper. So, experimental data is left out. It's a case study when it could be, you know, multiple children. The researchers trying to make general conclusions from one kid, as we see in the results and conclusion. The background information, a lot of it is irrelevant to what they're talking about. Cognitive theory is not brought up. The 6 stages of acquisition, they're not really improved upon at all. There's no new innovations there. There's nothing that the research is providing new information about. And they're making suggestions for parents when they don't even talk about parents at all, really. They're just making recommendations. So, if we were to summarize this paper, and even though it's not the best paper, we can still get some main points out of it. Like, what was the author trying to say? The class came up with a child's language acquisition is heavily influenced by their environment. Yeah, that's one of the main topics that they talked about for sure. And what I said is that according to the author, how they're writing this, what they're trying to say, what they're using the majority of their conclusion space for, is that a parent should have some control over their child's language acquisition. The author wants to put parents in this proactive role, but what they've written about in the paper does not support that final conclusion at all. So that is this week. If you have not read Hutauruk and you're just watching the lecture videos, you really should read it. It is a good example of how to not write a paper. And what you can take out of this is that be consistent between all your sections. Your introduction should introduce a problem. Your experiment and background information should be relevant to that introduction, relevant to that research question. And in your conclusion, you should be answering your research question. Don't steer off topic. We want to veer off topic all the time. It's what we do as humans. We study something, we find an interesting point, we go off and explore it, we change our minds, and then sometimes we don't update our papers to reflect that. So make sure when you go through your paper, the questions you have in the intro should be the questions you investigate for your entire paper, and those questions should be answered in the conclusion. Don't do what this did, which used an experimental method and then just didn't really provide any evidence of anything, at least in the paper. There's no transcripts. We cannot guarantee that anything that they said is accurate because they didn't provide data. So that's it. There's week 6. See you in week 7.